President Zelensky hasn't stopped his demands for more aid in Ukraine's fight with Russia. Speaking at a press conference on February 24th, he issued a stark warning to the U.S. if it fails to provide more assistance. Let's watch.
If it happens so that Ukraine, due to various opinions and weakening and depleting of assistance, loses, Russia is going to enter Baltic states, NATO member states, and then the U.S. will have to send their sons and daughters exactly the same way as we are sending their sons and daughters to war, and they will have to fight because it's NATO that we're talking about, and they will be dying, God forbid, because it's a horrible thing.
Meanwhile, Pentagon officials went before two House committees on Tuesday to testify on U.S. military assistance to the war-torn country. Lawmakers grilled the officials about how they're monitoring U.S. arms and weapons sent to Ukraine. Some members have been vocal that Congress will not be used to write blank checks. That funding needs to be justified in detail for it to continue. So Zelensky was saying there that, you know, Ukraine's got to be the last stand because if we get overrun, then Russia is going to invade a NATO member, and then the U.S. is going to have to send ground troops, which, like, yeah, if Russia invades a NATO member, that has a high likelihood of having World War III, but they're not going to do that.
Right, that's the whole point. It's such a backward argument. The whole point of Russia invading Ukraine is to prevent it from being a NATO member. Like the reason that this invasion has happened is because it is not a NATO member and it doesn't want NATO to continue to expand. It's like a hyper consciousness of not wanting to engage directly with NATO members that has kind of is at the core of this crisis. So it's such a weird backward argument to make, to say that Ukraine is somehow the last bulwark against Russia. If Russia wants to attack a NATO member because it's just thirsting for a war with the rest of the world, it can do that.
If Russia wants to start World War III, it can press the button anytime it wants.
There's not some magical wall.
Yeah.
It's not like it's like a gameplay, and until you defeat Ukraine, you're not allowed to go and invade another country.
It's like the risk board. You can't, well, Ukraine borders, actually, Europe is a pretty easy continent to move around in the game of Risk, so it's worth 5 extra deployments on your turn.
Right. And speaking of the game of Risk and kind of the global circumstances of this, it's really interesting to note there was this Washington Post article from just a few days ago called "A Global Divide on the Ukraine War is Deepening." And they talked to folks, particularly in the global south. It opens with a quote from a South African radio host who says, quote, we were lied to. And the article basically makes the argument, you know, here's what he goes on to say, you know, why had President Vladimir Putin deemed it necessary to invade? Why was NATO fueling fire? Those are the questions that have been percolating in the Western media. But the other parts of the world are saying, you know, when America went to Iraq, when America went to Libya, they had their own justifications that we didn't believe. And now they're trying to turn the world against Russia. This is unacceptable, too. I still don't see any justification for invading a country, but we cannot be dictated to about the Russian moves in Ukraine. I honestly feel like the U.S. was trying to bully us. And this is a sentiment that goes around the world. Other countries, this article focuses on a lot on people in India who have increased trade. India increased trade with Russia by 400% since the invasion. There's a global economy. People need oil. Obviously, we've been talking about the Nord Stream pipeline explosion and who did it, because so much of Europe, Germany in particular, relies on Russian natural gas to heat their homes and get through a winter. And it's becoming increasingly clear to people, especially outside of the U.S. media bubble, that we are pressing our agenda, which is not shared with all of these other countries around the world, and which, frankly, is at their detriment.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you see that interview, actually, by the way, the other day? Jeffrey Sachs, who is someone we've talked about on the show a lot, who has asserted that he thinks the U.S. is responsible for
testified at the UN
Nord Stream,
committee on it
at Russia's invitation, although he said he was there representing himself, not Russia. He had a great interview in, I think, the the New Yorker, with Isaac Chotiner the other day. I don't know how to say that either. So it was a long, very interrogating interview from a journalist who is, I think, much more hawkish on Ukraine. This person also interviewed John
Mearsheimer, yeah.
I've got some hard names in this segment. Kind of interrogating him about his view that this is really the U.S.'s fault for NATO hawkishness. And it's a good interview. I don't agree with everything Sachs says, but he just makes this point that no one, I think, can really refute on the other side, which is that, you know, he says that he warned U.S. officials for years, Russia is very is very concerned about NATO expansion, about Ukraine and a few other nations joining NATO. So, and this is very dangerous. There could be a war over this. And then the officials will say, no. Ukraine is never joining NATO. That's never going to happen. And then he'll say, well, why don't you then make that clear to Russia? If we're saying we're not going to let them join, then why, the leaving it a possibility without clarifying it to Russia is just a massive diplomatic failure that has helped get us to this position. We could have just been clear that was not going to happen, and then the pretext for this war, at least, would not have existed. Maybe that wouldn't have totally prevented it, but it might have. It might have lessened the odds of this happening. So we should have just been clear in our diplomacy instead of leaving it vague.
Yes, and that pretext point is, I think, really important. So many folks who are critical of U.S. engagement and how it's approached this conflict, and the fact that it's the argument that it's in fact invested in a proxy war with Russia for reasons that have very little to do with protecting the interests of Ukraine, is partly because the argument that this had to happen, Russia invaded, we didn't do anything, there was no provocation, is so weak. And if there were more evidence that the U.S. had done everything it could to de-escalate this crisis, if there hadn't been all these reports about negotiation sessions that the U.S. or the West, Boris Johnson, derailed, as we reported on back in the spring, and as that former Israeli prime minister just talked about last month and had to walk back a statement saying, well, yeah, there were these opportunities for negotiation and the West killed it. If it weren't for all of those moments, then I think there would be a lot more credibility in the West saying, okay, we did everything that we could to de-escalate, but Putin really is on the war path, and he really is all these things that have been said. But they've left sufficient ambiguity that, again, it's why you have so much of the global South saying, okay, you guys abandoned us in COVID, we didn't get any of the vaccines, we're the ones who are in all of these food crises. Ukraine is the bread basket of Europe. It's disrupting our energy supply. It's doing nothing but to hurt us. You've disrespected us. One of the people in this article mentioned how, Donald Trump antagonized Africa, calling it the SHIT places and stuff like that. So after all of this, America expects us to suit up and sacrifice for its war.
Yeah. I guess, and Zelensky expects it.
And Zelensky expects, it's a weird kind of a threat. It feels like a threat. He's not saying, obviously, Americans have to come and fight here.
He's saying the threat is coming from Russia, but...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that.
More Rising right after this.